Trump singles out China at the UN. China is spreading AI surveillance. And NASA fears China's space aggression. That and more on this week's China Uncensored. This is China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. This week's China news headlines. A major confrontation at the recent UN summit, a showdown we've all been waiting for. No, not Trump and Greta Thunberg. I'm talking about the showdown between Trump and China. We all knew it was coming. On Sunday, before the start of the summit, Trump's Secretary of State Mike Pompeo denounced the Communist Party's attempts to erase the mostly Muslim Uyghur ethnic minority. A Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman retorted that the U.S. has slandered China's policy towards Xinjiang and grossly interfered in China's internal affairs. Trump himself singled out China on trade issues and took aim at China's claim to be a developing country.
The second largest economy in the world should not be permitted to declare itself a developing country in order to game the system at others' expense.
Backing that call is the Australian Prime Minister. He also said that as a developed nation, China must do its part to combat climate change. Which I assume means Greta Thunberg will soon be making a trip to Beijing to protest climate change, where she will not be invited to give a speech. Meanwhile, back at the UN, President Trump had a message of support for Hong Kong.
The world fully expects that the Chinese government will honor its binding treaty made with the British and registered with the United Nations, in which China commits to protect Hong Kong's freedom, legal system, and democratic ways of life.
I'm sure Chinese authorities will get right on that. And in a final act of trolling, the U.S. invited Taiwan to the UN, specifically to a UN meeting that the U.S. was hosting on religious freedom. Taiwan has been trying for years to join the UN, and China has been trying for years to block them from joining the UN. In fact, this religious freedom meeting is the first time Taiwan has participated in a UN event since 1971. Also, at the same meeting, the U.S. invited the daughter of imprisoned Uyghur scholar Ilham Tohti to speak. I think I know where this is headed. And in another move that's bound to make Chinese authorities extremely uncomfortable, a well-known lawyer has urged the United Nations to investigate forced organ harvesting in China. Lawyer Hamid Sabi from the UK presented the findings of the China Tribunal, which wrapped up in June this year. The tribunal concluded that Chinese hospitals are cutting out the hearts and other organs from living, blameless, harmless, peaceable people, mainly Falun Gong practitioners. Falun Gong is a Chinese meditation practice with exercises that look a bit like Tai Chi. Chinese authorities banned it in 1999 after it became really popular, but refused to organize itself under party control. The solution? Arrest them and send them to labor camps. Falun Gong practitioners say the practice helps them stay healthy and fit. Chinese doctors agree. Their organs sure are healthy and ready to be forcibly transplanted. Sabi said this organ harvesting constitutes one of the worst mass atrocities of this century. China is preparing to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the communist takeover of China next week. And by celebrate, I mean you'd better celebrate. And Tibet is celebrating. The holiest temple in Lhasa has put up this banner that says, "May the great Communist Party live for 10,000 years. And if that still doesn't motivate you to celebrate, just like King George III, Beijing will send a fully armed battalion to remind you of their love."
There will be 59 formations and joint military band with 15,000 personnel. 160 planes and 580 sets of equipment are taking part in the parade, which will be the biggest military parade in recent years.
But Beijing faces serious threats that make even 15,000 armed troops quiver in their shiny boots. That's why they've banned the most dangerous elements: kites and pigeons. Balloons, too. No, that's not a joke. The parade will pass along Tiananmen Square. I personally can't wait. I don't think I've seen so many tanks in Tiananmen Square since never. There were never any tanks there. According to this study by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, China is supplying much of the world with AI surveillance technology. 63 out of 176 countries surveyed use Chinese AI tech. At least 50 of those have gotten it from Huawei. There is also considerable overlap between China's Belt and Road Initiative and AI surveillance. 36 out of 86 BRI countries also contain significant AI surveillance technology. And if you still somehow have doubts about whether Chinese tech companies like Huawei or Alibaba are independent from the Chinese Communist Party, don't worry. The Chinese Communist Party is working hard to erase your doubts. Chinese officials in Hangzhou will assign government representatives to work within 100 local companies, including Alibaba Group, a new indication of the Chinese government's increasingly close monitoring of private companies. Bad news for Taiwan. In less than a week after losing Solomon Islands as a diplomatic ally, Taiwan has now lost yet another one, the island nation of Kiribati. If you didn't know, Kiribati is here. Now sure, Kiribati only has a population roughly the size of my apartment building in Queens. But their pulling out means Taiwan now only has 15 countries that officially recognize its existence. The Chinese Communist Party has vowed to conquer Taiwan by 2020, by force if necessary. And as a Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman said after nabbing Kiribati,
what should happen will come sooner or later. Please remain calm. Everyone should.
Nice and cryptic. According to the congressionally funded U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, there's been progress in the trade war. The U.S. goods deficit with China totaled $32.8 billion in July, down 11% year on year. Meanwhile, President Trump says the U.S. is making a lot of progress. He said the United States is taking in billions from tariffs imposed on Chinese imports, and the total would soon reach $100 billion. Trade talks have resumed, and the administration has lifted tariffs on 400 Chinese goods, things ranging from circuit boards to dog collars to miniature Christmas trees. Trump says that's because we're winning, but depending on what media you read, it's a sign we're losing. And the administration is trying desperately to reduce the pressure. So sometimes it's hard to tell what's real from what's fake, unless we're talking about Impossible Foods, the fake meat company. They have plans to enter the China market in the next year, which will be really confusing for the Chinese Communist Party. The typical modus operandi is to bring in foreign companies, steal their intellectual property, and churn out a Chinese-made knockoff. But what will a knockoff of knockoff meat look like? On Tuesday, the head of NASA accused China of aggressive space activity. China has been developing anti-satellite technology for years. In fact, China was heavily criticized for an anti-satellite missile test in 2007 that blew up one of their own satellites and created a giant cloud of space debris. That's something NASA's head says they're going to fight. It's important for people to understand that we are not going to allow investments that could potentially destroy space. If we're going to achieve what NASA wants to achieve, we can't have people threatening to wreck low Earth orbit. Perhaps most worrying of all was the news that that's no moon, it's a battle station. And that's it for this week's China News Headlines. Now it's time for me to answer a question from one of you, a fan who supports China Uncensored with $1 or more per episode by contributing through the crowdfunding website Patreon. Josiah Faber asks, have they stopped their Belt and Road Initiative since the trade war began, as they have been losing so much money? The Belt and Road lumbers on. China has already invested a lot of money around the world through the Belt and Road Initiative, which means many countries still owe China a lot of money. As recently as March, China nabbed its first G7 country, Italy, for the Belt and Road. But as countries around the world have wised up to China's debt trap diplomacy, and as China faces more economic pressure from the US-China trade war, it's been put on the defensive. Since last year, they've been talking now about sustainable debt, while also being forced to hold back money from projects left unfinished. But that doesn't mean the Belt and Road is over, not by a long shot. Malaysia had become one of the toughest opponents of the Belt and Road. However, that changed in April this year. China has announced that it has persuaded Malaysia to resume a canceled rail project worth $10.7 billion. Because at the end of the day, the Chinese Communist Party seeks world domination, and the Belt and Road is a key part of that. Thanks for your question. And if you have a question for me you want to hear answered on the show, sign up to join the China Uncensored 50 Cent Army by supporting the show with $1 or more per episode. Again, YouTube is demonetizing us so much, we would have to shut down the show if it weren't for your support. And to everyone, thanks for watching. Once again, I'm your host, Chris Chappell. See you next time.